In this video, we'll be reviewing Jeffrey Pfeffer and Bob Sutton's Hard Facts, Dangerous Half-Truths, and Total Nonsense, an exploration of how to profit and benefit from evidence-based management in organizations. Welcome to Strategy Books, introducing leaders to the books and ideas that make a difference, and most importantly, the books that can help you make a difference in the world around you. Hit the subscribe button to stay current and that bell to be notified every time there's a new video up. I'm Mark Mullally, follow me here, and you can also connect on Twitter and Instagram at strategy_books. As always, the links to everything we discussed today can be found in the description below. So, let's get started. So one of the really interesting things about this book, as I said, it's written by Jeffrey Pfeffer and Bob Sutton. They are profs at Stanford University. They are both independently, they do work together, but they do also do a lot of writing on their own. They are both independently two of my absolutely favorite authors in the world of business. Jeffrey Pfeffer, I originally came across in a glorious book that he wrote, and I think we'll actually probably do a review of it in a few weeks or so. That is called Leadership BS. Fixing Workplaces and Careers, One Truth at a Time. And it truly goes all the way to irreverent, but it does it in a way that is honest, and that is bold, and that is candid, and that is incredibly useful and relevant. Bob Sutton also is a huge figure astride the world of strategy. He's actually an organizational psychologist. Again, he's a professor of management science and engineering at Stanford. He was also the founder of both Stanford Technology Ventures and also their famed D School. And so he's done a lot in terms of catalyzing and promoting, bringing new and different perspectives to the world of business and being able to actually manage and make meaning effectively within organizations. And again, amplify the things that work, try to expose and minimize the things that don't work. And he's now co-director of their executive education program. Together, in addition to writing this book, Hard Facts, Dangerous Half-Truths, and Total Nonsense, this is actually their second book in their partnership. The first book they wrote was also a landmark classic called The Knowing-Doing Gap. If you haven't read it, again, I highly recommend it. It is on the list of books that we're going to review. I didn't want to make this all about them in multiple broadcasts, though, so we're going to space those out a little bit. But it's a fascinating exploration of the fact that we do not do the things that we know we should do. The reality is, for most organizations and for most managers, we know how to be able to do things effectively. We know what we should be doing. We just don't do it. And so the knowing-doing gap was an exploration of why is that? Where does that come from? And how can we actually change that? How can we do that differently? And to a certain extent, this book could be called The Doing-Knowing Gap. And knowing them, I'm sure they absolutely considered that as a possible working title before they came up with what they did actually go with, Hard Facts, Dangerous Half-Truths, and Total Nonsense, which has its own, line of irreverence going for it. But it's about doing things without knowing that they work. And to a certain extent, trusting on it worked for somebody else, or it is commonly received and accepted wisdom. And the challenge with that is that commonly received and accepted wisdom often isn't. There are numerous anecdotes and perspectives. Nobody got fired, for example, for buying IBM. But is that actually the best solution for what we're looking for, or is that simply the safe solution that we're going with? And this is where we run into a lot of challenges within organizations and within organizational functioning. Just the whole concept of best practices and the myth that there is such a thing as best practices, because it is a myth. There are best practices if what you are dealing with is something that is incredibly granular and incredibly simple and has a extremely fundamental basic cause and effect reaction that can actually say, in this situation, to do this thing, this is the best way to be able to proceed. But in anything that we're dealing with, like the level of organizational functioning, like the level of organizational strategy, managing change, problem solving, implementing complex solutions, best practices do not exist. And yet, there is this manifest belief that they do, and that we should adopt them. And if you are not adopting, quote, best practice, whatever that might actually be, whether that is Agile or Six Sigma or PMBOK or OKRs, or just to go back a little bit before OKRs, the balanced scorecard. If you're not doing that, then you're simply doing it wrong. And the challenge with that is that entire stance, A, is ideological, because there are people that are fundamentally sold on a way of doing it. It's the way that they know. It's popular, it is trendy, it has a lot of people talking about it, and therefore the presumption is it must be good. It must be relevant. If I do that, I will be successful. And yet, with so many of these practices, the answer to that is actually no. You're not going to be. And the fundamental problem there is because we're not dealing with the fundamental principles of what are we trying to do and how are we trying to do it and what's the problem that we are trying to solve and what are the essential principles and guidelines and frameworks and boundaries and constraints that we need to be put in place in a way that's appropriate here. What we're doing is we're taking the surface appearance of process and structure and tools, we're implementing them wholesale, and they don't work. And that's really what this book dives into, is the fact that there are fundamental truths, and they specifically refer to them as half-truths. And that's a really useful and important terminology, because what it's basically saying there is they're not wholly wrong. There's some kernel of reason of why those ideas are there, but they're not right either. And the danger of following a half-truth is that it has a surface appeal, it has a perceived value, there's a perception of it's a shortcut to success, I'll do that and it'll work for me. And that's where the fundamental danger is. Like, we actually break apart the title, and it's an important one. Hard facts, you're all good. I mean, the basic principle there is you know what you know it's effective, you've got factual information to be able to back it up. The problem with that being, it is not as frequent as we might actually like to believe that we actually have the hard facts necessary to be able to know we're making an informed, appropriate, relevant decisions. Now, total nonsense, that's a different problem. And that we can fundamentally, confidently ignore. Because it is total nonsense, and we know it's total nonsense, and it might be somebody's fad, but it's relatively easy to undercut, and it's probably not going to get a lot of traction. The danger, and what this book is really about, and my shorthand in terms of talking about this book when I actually write it, because it's a long title, I'm not actually referring to hard facts. My shorthand title for this book is half-truths. If you go through all of my notes, that is what my shorthand reference to this is, because it's really what the book is actually about. It is trying to go after the very dangerous, very real, very persistent things that sort of might be true, but aren't really. And that's really where the problem lies, is that they're things that sound good. They're things that are appealing. They're things that have a kernel of truth, but they're not actually true. And so there's a risk of relying on those, and then, as a result, suffering through the consequences of having done so. When we talk about this book, some of the highlights for me is it does make the case for an evidence-based approach. And that's really the subtitle, is that it is profiting from evidence-based management. And what it's trying to do is put facts and evidence front and center. It's the idea of evidence-based management. It's related to the idea of evidence-based medicine, the idea that, we need to, if we are prescribing something, whether we're prescribing that for a patient that is a person seeking a medical intervention, or we are prescribing that for an organization that is seeking a strategic intervention, when that prescription is made, it needs to be made on the best science possible. It needs to be made on the best knowledge possible, an understanding and knowing of what works, what makes sense, what actually delivers positive results. And when we don't do that, when we go with fads, when we go with trends, and that has been and is, and certainly was from the outset of medicine, absolutely true. It's also true within organizations, and it has been true within organizations for time immemorial. The idea that you have executives, for example, that come into an organization and fundamentally simply go with, this is my way of doing things. This is my model. Sweep away whatever has been there before because it came before, and introduce an entirely new way of operating based upon their principles, their philosophy, their techniques, because they are in charge now. Anytime you've seen that, and we've seen it so many times, oftentimes you're getting rid of effective solutions that actually did work. Possibly not at the outset, but because over time the organization figured out how to be able to function with those, and you're parachuting in something that wasn't invented here, wasn't invented for here, and yet is now expected to work here simply because the new executive in charge said so. And that is often the fundamental challenge. And so what we're trying to do is make the case for, if you're going to do something in an organization, to an organization, for an organization, make sure that it works. And what it highlights is many organizations that have actually benefited from or profited above their expectations based upon their ability to actually emphasize facts and data in their decision making and their organizational functioning. One of the things, though, in gaps and concerns in terms of what the authors were doing, the emphasis in this book fundamentally is on what not to do. In practicing evidence-based management, what they're doing is they're taking the time to expose the half-truths that go with organizational management. And there are 6 that they basically rip apart. The idea that, or the question, is work fundamentally different than the rest of life should be? Should we be different people at work? Should we operate differently? Should we have different norms and rules? And that gets to the heart of a phrase and a saying that has always rubbed me the wrong way. People behaving in a way that is fundamentally callous and self-interested, and above all for their interests, and apologizing away that by behavior by saying it's just business. And the implication behind that is, I don't behave that way in my real life, but because this is business, it's expected of me, it's required of me, it's what I do, or at least how I function. And so they ask the question, is work fundamentally different? Should work fundamentally be different than the rest of our lives? They ask, do the best organizations have the best people? And again, that is a fundamental supposition. We look at the top organizations in any industry, and the presumption is, both because of profitability and smarts and appeal, that the cream of the crop is actually going to move to there, and that's where all the good stuff is actually going to happen. Completely underlying the many organizational underdogs that do and perform well, despite not necessarily being able to afford or to attract the absolute elite talent, but are able to organize and manage and be effective nonetheless with, if you want to call it the B team or the middle tier or whoever they're able to attract. They go after, do financial incentives actually drive company or organizational performance? Is it about the rewards that determine the functioning? And the reality is there's a dimension of, yes, it is, but be careful of what you're rewarding, because that's what you might get. And they go after the idea of, for example, stock options as an effective reward, where fundamentally what that drives as behavior is manipulation and deceit and short-term interest in decision-making in order to be able to amplify the personal benefit of the executives that actually have those stock options. It doesn't actually drive long-term behavior in a period of years and decades. It drives short-term behavior for short-term profit for the self-interest of the individuals with the options, not the organization providing them. They go after the question and assertion, is strategy destiny? The strategy that you have fundamentally determines the outcomes that you will realize. Do you have to change or die? One of my favorites out of this, the idea that if you are not changing, if you are not growing, then you're decaying and dying. And they have a lot of fun with this one, because often what we deal with is, what's the latest buzzword? What's the latest trend? And in doing that, we throw out the baby with the bathwater. We go, old inappropriate, irrelevant, because old, what's new and modern. And the really interesting thing is in some knowledge disciplines, like medicine, for example, the idea that you would be relying on researcher papers that were done 3 or 4 or 5 years ago is, or 8 or 10, would be unthinkable. You want to be keeping up with the latest advances and the latest knowledge and the latest insights and the latest case references. And at the same time, when you actually look at the management literature, some of the fundamentals are still true. Some of the classics of, I'm not talking about 5 or 10 years ago, I'm talking about 50 and 100 years ago, are still fundamentally relevant in terms of organizational functioning. And the huge scholarship and work that was done in the 1970s and the 1980s, and in particular the 1990s, that really doesn't get any airtime or visibility today because it's old, it's outdated, it's not relevant anymore, is absolute hogwash. Some of it is incredible and profound and useful, and going back to Pfeffer and Sutton's other book, The Knowing and Doing Gap, not actually ever been implemented effectively in a broad number of organizations. We know we should be doing that, we're just simply not doing it. And then the last thing they go after are great leaders in control of their organizations or their companies. Does the leader at the top actually drive and have the influence and create the results that the organization actually delivers? And again, they have a lot of fun going after the fact that for many organizational leaders, they feel actually removed and distant and isolated, and that they have very little control. They have very little influence apart from cheerleading and championing and giving speeches and trying to influence the overall functioning of the organization. And all of these statements, all of these principles have a fundamental kernel of truth and are taken almost as gospel, face value, as being fundamentally truth, and yet have significant amounts of data behind them to go, it's just not so. And that's what this book really dives into, is the debunking of the half-truths. Within the book, there is an introduction to evidence-based management. The first chapter talks about why you should do it. The second chapter talks about how to practice it. The very final chapter talks about how to actually then profit from evidence-based management. But the bulk of the book is what not to do. And the emphasis is on, here's the mistakes that people make. Here are the misguided rules of thumb and the ill-informed conventions and assumptions that drive a lot of business thinking in far too many organizations. And when you get down to it, that actually may be what people need here. That they need to first debunk and undermine the accepted truths that actually aren't, before they're actually prepared to actually focus on figuring out what actually works. And so they provide a useful service. They do provide a huge amount of insight and depth in terms of case studies, in terms of examples. It's well researched, it's well supported, it's well referenced, and they provide a lot of both illustrations of strategies that have worked, but in particular, strategies that have not worked, and the fact that the data exists, the research is out there, the information is available, but organizations do not think to, or don't do the heavy work necessary to, actually learn and understand and relate to how that applies to their situation in order to be able to do something about it. Now, in terms of what I got out of the book, its relevance to me, my career has been focused on growing upstream. It's been focused on debunking a lot of the different conventions, challenging conventional thinking, countering bad information, trying to provide better information and research, and being able to guide solutions that actually make sense and work for that organization because they're relevant and appropriate and fit the culture and actually make sense. And so where this fits is about working with what is known, and it's calling for more rigor and more discipline and more effectiveness in decision making, which isn't about necessarily making it completely rational, because it's important to be able to recognize we all operate in a world of bounded rationality. We cannot know everything about everything. We cannot, and the danger we run into, And this is another one of those buzzwords and conventions, the idea of analysis paralysis. That is a convenient, nice shortcut to say, let's not spend any more time thinking about this. And what Pfeffer and Sutton do within the book is say, actually hang on. You can afford to spend a little bit of time thinking about this. What's out there? What is known? What has been done within other organizations? What research is available to be able to support the figuring out a solution to the to the problem that you're trying to solve, or validating the solution that you want to proceed with and the approach that you want to take, to be able to say, well, what do we know about that? What do we know about how it works? What do we know about how to be successful in terms of doing it? What do we know about the potential pitfalls behind it? What do we know about, does it actually make sense, and is this a reasonable and better way to be able to proceed forward for this particular situation? And to give an illustration example of that, going back to one of the ideas that they were talking about and debunking within their overall book, the idea of, do financial incentives enhance company performance? They actually provide a lot of examples of where it doesn't, but they also provide a couple that do. So, for example, thinking about individual performance bonuses and individual performance compensation based on contribution and results, they actually can be effective. But they can only be effective in very specific, isolated circumstances where people are fundamentally in control of their work and how they do it. They are not interdependent with others. They work in relative isolation, and they are able to manage their workload, but still have a level of independent checking and quality assurance to be able to say, if shortcuts occur, it will be clear that they have occurred, and there will be appropriate and relevant consequences for that. In other words, that if you try to be more productive by basically taking a lot of shortcuts, doing a shoddy job, and not doing it well, it's going to be self-evident that that's occurred. It's going to be obvious who did it. And there's going to be the ability then to be able to implement appropriate consequences and punishments to be able to make sure that it doesn't actually happen again. In all of those circumstances, performance-based pay can work, and can work very effectively, because people feel that they are then incented appropriately to be able to say, I'm going to work as much as I can to be able to get the revenue that I want to earn. But anywhere where there's that lack of control, there is a level of interdependence, there isn't the ability to be able to isolate and identify either performance issues or where they occurred or who was responsible for them, incentive pay is actually proven to be a relatively bad idea. And so, when you think about where this fits, it's dealing with helping to, again, make an argument for, do the rigor to be able to say, what are the consequences of proceeding with it? Know what's already out there, know what's been done, and what the experience of that has actually been. Be able to better use data that is available. So thinking about what data exists within our organization that we can apply, how might we need to think about it, evaluate it, analyze it, or restructure or collect it differently to be more meaningful, and to be able to then follow on what it actually tells you. They provide a really useful and valuable insight about the fact that don't get too stuck on, you've got to be able to measure it quantitatively. And if it's not quantitative, if it's not specific, actual direct measure of something, that it's not relevant. The qualitative measures can be, and often are, as or more relevant, particularly about addressing, thinking about, and trying to solve or answer some of the bigger, more strategic problems and challenges that organizations deal with. And they also talk about the value of conducting experiments and being able to think about effectively and well, before we go and do something, how can we get data to be able to measure and evaluate the impact of what's going to occur? And whether that's as simple as A/B testing, although it's important to be able to recognize that when you actually just put out two different things and evaluate performance just to see which one is most effective, the question you still need to be thinking about is why? What was more effective about the thing that got more traffic, more volume, more hits, more profitability than the other alternative. But whether it's about A/B testing, whether it's about actually doing piloting within organizations, whether it is starting to do work on a limited scale with a product line or a particular client or a particular service area, to be able to say, is this actually an intervention that will measurably improve and make a difference for the organization? And how do we make sure it's the most effective for this organization before we actually do it on a wide scale basis? So for me, takeaways and value, what the authors have accomplished is they provided a really good introduction to evidence-based management, and particularly case studies and exploration of how organizations actually get it wrong. What they missed. There's some intriguing conflicts. I wouldn't say it's a miss so much as there are a few things that they identify in different chapters of the book that in essence are in conflict with each other. And it's not obvious to me that the authors are actually aware of those, although they describe their development process as arguing with each other. So it's entirely possible that they are, or they have at least identified them and they've allowed them to continue. And so specifically, for example, in the discussion of work and life, do we need to be different at work than we are in our normal real lives? They make a huge case for the value and the necessity and the effectiveness of being our authentic selves and being able to be ourselves. And to the extent that we feel pressured or unable, or that it is inappropriate or frowned upon to bring the whole of who we are to work, then that is perhaps the wrong environment for us. And we need to be able to think about another one, a different one. And they provide a couple of explanations of where people with very different styles and personalities and approaches felt very limited and constrained earlier or previous positions within their career before they actually found the home and the place where they were able to thrive and succeed and be effective and really step into themselves. And so the real principle behind it is no, work and life shouldn't be separate. Except then you get to the chapters around, for example, change and leadership and the idea of what does it take to actually have successful change occur? How do you get people to move from their comfort zone and place of safety to an alternative way of working? How do you actually lead within organizations, and how do you be an effective leader? What they talk about there is the need to play a role, to craft narratives, to be able to deliver a specific message and have it received in a particular way, to tell stories, and ultimately to project confidence even when it's not actually felt, and suppress self-doubt even when that's significantly there. And they ultimately acknowledge that what we're trying to do there is manipulate perceptions in a theoretically positive way to get the organization to be able to move the way that it actually needs to move. And so what we have there is inherently a conflict between, do I show up as me or am I playing a role? And depending on the chapter that you're reading, Pfeffer and Sutton basically say yes. And this is where we get into nuance and we get into detail, because we aren't always just ourselves, and we often do have to play a role. And we have to play a role not just at work, but also within our personal lives. And so we show up in different ways for different people. And I might be splitting hairs here, but it's an important recognition of there aren't hard and fast guidelines, even in what they debunk. The reason that we're dealing with half-truths is because there's a bit of truth in there. There's a bit of value that we can identify, but it's not all there. And there are underlying assumptions and perceptions and beliefs and views that fundamentally need to be challenged because they aren't supported, because they don't work, because they don't actually deliver results. So it makes a really important contribution to understanding evidence-based management, why more organizations should do it, and in particular, it's a strong reinforcement that the things you believe or hold about organizational performance aren't necessarily actually true. In fact, many of them are myths. But it misses a couple of things. And I think what it still needed, it needs first off recognition that doing all of this is incredibly hard work. That getting to evidence-based management and thinking about how evidence-based management actually works and finding ways to be able to make it work isn't easy, isn't obvious, and is still going to take some effort to be able to accomplish. Now, around that, what I'd like to do is to share with you a couple of insights that specifically come from the book. If I can find where it was. And here we go. Leaders of for-profit companies aren't alone in ignoring data and making worse decisions as a result. Implementing evidence-based practice is an uphill battle in a lot of different domains. In public policy, the disconnect between science and policy is nothing short of astonishing, as politicians ignore science that doesn't yield the answer that they want. In law enforcement, psychologist Gary Wells has demonstrated repeatedly that when eyewitnesses are asked to pick a suspect from a traditional lineup where all suspects stand shoulder to shoulder, or eyewitnesses see what's referred to as a six-pack of suspect photos all at once, they consistently make identification errors. Even when the real suspect is not in the lineup, witnesses will often falsely finger the person who looks most like the suspect anyway. About 3/4 of the people exonerated by DNA evidence were falsely identified by eyewitnesses in lineups. Wells has shown that eyewitnesses make far fewer errors when presented one suspect at a time, and there's no particular expense or technology barrier to showing people pictures or suspects sequentially rather than all at once. And yet, although Wells has spent 20 years campaigning to convince police departments to use sequential lineups, only 4 out of over 19,000 legal jurisdictions have actually implemented this evidence-based practice. Or take education. In early 2005, California Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger proposed attacking school performance problems with merit pay for teachers. He didn't talk about evidence that supported this idea, perhaps because little exists. As we saw in Chapter 1, decades of research have failed to produce evidence that merit pay in schools has positive effects on learning. Or consider healthcare, particularly patient safety and the prevention of unnecessary death and complications. Study after study confirms that when hospitals have a higher ratio of nurses to patients and limit nurses' work hours, patients have lower death rates and fewer complications and infections. And yet few of these insights have actually been implemented, and hospital administrators routinely resist mandated nursing staffing ratios and work hours. When it comes to public policy, education, and healthcare, much like management, ideology and false hope regularly trump the evidence, which wastes both money and lives. When the late Peter Drucker was asked why managers fall for bad advice and fail to use sound evidence, he didn't mince words. Thinking is very hard work, and management fashions are a wonderful shortcut for thinking. And that's the challenge. In terms of what's still needed, there's a need to recognize this is hard work. Researching, exploring, experimenting, getting data, finding meaning within that data, being comfortable about the fact that the hypothesis you went in with is not the answer that you were hoping for, and something very, very different needs to occur. That's not a bad thing. It's reality, but it's an uncomfortable reality. We don't like things that are hard work. We'd like to think that there's an easy answer, that there's a black and white, that if we just pay for the expertise, if we find the right consultant, they can tell us, oh, just do this and it'll be fine. And this is the book that reinforces you need to do the work. It won't tell you how to do the work, but it reinforces that you need to. So should you read it? I believe it's absolutely worthwhile, as I do the Knowing Doing Gap, and look forward to that review in a little while. Why I think that? It's well written, it's insightful, it has some really excellent illustrations and examples and case studies that support the arguments that the authors are making. And it provides an important message that people, whether in business, whether in government, whether in not-for-profits, need to hear, and particularly executives. The challenge with that is the ones that most need to hear it are possibly the ones that won't read it. What should you look for? Read it for the stories. Consider how you react to those stories. There are a lot of sacred cows they set up and take down, and they do so in a convincing, definitive way. That doesn't mean you're always going to be comfortable about that. That doesn't mean that you're always going to be thrilled about what they have to say. And so it's an important question to think, well, what's behind that? What's the reaction that you're having? Why might you be resisting an argument that they're making? Why might something be feeling uncomfortable or causing resistance? Those are clues where you may have blind spots and biases you want to be able to explore in more detail. How deep should you go? There's only so deep in this book you can go. And that's not a criticism, it's just fundamental truth. This isn't a book about how to. It is an illustration of what is possible. And it's an argument for practice and for a way of thinking and working that many organizations simply don't apply. You ultimately still need to do the work to actually build that practice. And to be able to do that and to be able to do that well, you're going to need to go elsewhere to be able to get that support. And so it's a great book. It's wonderful reading. As I say, it is my couple of my favorite authors that are rarely without things to say and without things to say well. And I think they definitively do an incredibly good job here in terms of being able to do that. Thanks for joining us on Strategy Books. We'll be back with another episode soon. If you're interested in the books that we talked about today, you'll find links to them in the description below. Be sure to subscribe, and if you enjoyed today's recording, please hit that like button as well. It helps others to find the recording. Let me know what you got out of the book in the comments below. Comment as well if you've got questions or if you've got an idea for a future book to review. Thanks so much for joining us, and we'll see you again next time.